I'll tell you, by nature, I'm not a person who likes conflict. In fact, most people don't like conflict. Yet it is a reality. It is a part of life. It is a part of ministry. And believe it or not, there's some good things that can come from it. So I want to approach this topic from the standpoint of how can we grow through conflict. First, recognize that conflict is a part of life together. In the context of a worship team, production team, you've got a whole team full of sinful people, and there's bound to be some rough spots. There's bound to be some personality clashes, feelings that will get hurt, and not everyone's going to agree 100% with every decision. And not everyone, even in a marriage, surprisingly, agrees all the time. And that's a joke, right? Marriage is certainly a way that you reveal conflict, because you have two people living in close proximity who have vowed to knit their lives together, and they will find some rough patches. I remember when we were newly married, my wife and I went to a Sunday school class, and there were some couples in that class who had been married for quite some time. In fact, we chose to be in a class, multi-generational class, because we, as a young couple, we wanted to learn from the pros, right? There was a couple in that class that said that they had never had a fight in 15 years. Well, at that point, my wife and I just looked at each other after less than 1 year of marriage, and we're like, oh man, we better give it up. Instead, we learned how to get the best out of conflict. Conflict can be very constructive and even life-giving if it's welcomed and handled well. Proverbs 27:17 says, "As iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another." Yes, there is friction that's produced in that process, but there can be a mutual sharpening that takes place with conflict. Lincoln, the great president, famously put together a team of rivals in his cabinet. He deliberately chose men who didn't like each other, had different perspectives, and so this is, I think, one of the things that made him a great president. He was willing to listen to constructive criticism and hear other voices besides his own echo chamber. Avoiding conflict breaks down relationships and trust. Now, this is very common in ministry, because I find that a lot of pastors tend to be conflict averse, and we want to make everyone happy. We want to be peacekeepers. We want our flock to be peaceful, and so we tend, by nature perhaps, to avoid conflict. And what happens when we do that is relationships break down. Trust breaks down. We begin to work around people instead of working with people, and that's never good. When is conflict good? When can conflict be good? Well, one is when it energizes and clarifies a situation. I mean, sometimes that'll happen. I mean, sometimes it happens in a marriage. There's an argument that arises, and what that allows you to do is to go a little deeper and find out what's really going on here. What's the deeper issue? Conflict can do that. It forces us to examine our goals, our purposes, our values to their core. So it can be an incredible focusing mechanism. When it results in personal and team growth, conflict is good. I can tell you, the scriptures tell you that two are better than one. In whether it's a friendship or a marriage, that my marriage to my wife has made me so much better in so many ways, that her sharpening of me has been a tremendous blessing. The same thing will be true if you take conflict and work it for the good. So I'd like for you to pause the video right here for a moment and ask yourself that question. Can you think of a time where conflict was a good thing on a team that you were part of? A worship team, a sports team, an academic team, whatever it might have been. Can you think of a time where conflict occurred and how good things came out of it? Take a minute to think about that, pause that video, and answer that in the comments. Thankfully, we have some great resources in Scripture when it comes to resolving conflict. There are two primary passages that I'd refer you to. The first would be Matthew 5:23 through 24. This is in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. He says, "Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you," that's conflict, "leave your gift there in front of the altar." In other words, stop worshiping. Then first go and be reconciled to them, then come and offer your gift. And so the precedent here is to seek resolution quickly, even if it's in the middle of worship. He says, stop it. stop worshiping and be reconciled to your brother or sister. So that reminds us that this needs to be done as soon as possible. There's no advantage, generally speaking, in delaying. When there's conflict, it doesn't get better by just letting it simmer. The second major text would be Matthew chapter 18, verses 15 through 20. And here the text says, "If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone." So the first principle is don't gossip, don't spread the conflict wisely. Focus on the people that are directly involved and no one else. Keep it right there. Verse 16 then goes on to say, "But if he does not listen, take one or two others along with you, so that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses." So if you get stuck on the one-on-one conversation, then invite someone else or two to join you to help you work things out. Bring in some kind of arbitrator, objective, third-party witness to straighten things out. Verse 17, "If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church, and if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile or a tax collector." And we'll skip down to verse 21. In other words, if you can't resolve it, then you have to agree to disagree, and there has to be some kind of separation would be the principle there. Matthew 18:21 through 35 goes on to be an example of the level of forgiveness. Now, before you kick someone out, before you completely sever that relationship, Jesus wants to say to us what Peter asked at that point. Peter came up and said, "Lord, how often will my brother sin against me and I forgive him? As many as 7 times?" And Peter thinks he's being generous here. If I forgave someone 7 times, Jesus said to him, "I do not say to you 7 times, but 77 times." And of course, this is hyperbole. He's exaggerating. He's saying, you forgive as you've been forgiven. And then he goes on to tell the story of the unforgiving servant, a servant who was forgiven a tremendous sum of money. His debt was canceled, and yet he was unwilling to cancel the debt of a fellow servant of far, far less. And the point being here is that in the case of conflict, we've taken these steps and done our very best to have a resolution. At the end of the day, we are still responsible to forgive again, to forgive as you have been forgiven. So as always, grace wins out. In the nature of conflict, we're going to have difficult conversations at times. What are some of the difficult conversations you might need to have in worship ministry? I'm just going to list these because I've had all these conversations with people over the years. 1, you're always late. You can't be counted on. 2, you only come to church when you're scheduled to play. Maybe you've known people like that the only time you see them is when they're on the rotation to play. They're not involved in the church in any other way. Not prepared for rehearsal. This is a person who never practices, and they show up to rehearsal, and they're just wasting our time because they haven't worked out their part, and you have, and it just grinds inside, doesn't it? Your playing or singing is not the level that we need to be. This is a tough one. Ideally, you don't want to have someone on your team that you'd have to have this conversation with. This goes back to auditioning and selecting your team members. But if you do have to have this conversation, that can be a rough one. Here's one, and this you could fill in the blank with any kind of moral situation, but when there's some kind of moral question that's going on in someone's life in a very open way that people know about, then you have to have this conversation. So at this point in the class, if we were together, I would have you role play these. I'd pair you up, and you could practice having these conversations and being uncomfortable. And I think that is a good thing to do if you are going to have one of these conversations, is to role play it ahead of time, get some practice ahead of time. And again, thankfully, we have a great example from Scripture on how to have difficult conversations. I can't think of one that might have been more difficult than the one between Nathan, the prophet, and David, the king. Now, this was a difficult conversation because Nathan was confronting someone in authority over him. David was the king. That meant he was the sovereign. He could off Nathan's head if he wanted to. Now, Nathan was a prophet, and Nathan understood authority and understood that ultimately he was accountable to God. So that's one thing when it comes to dealing with a conversation that you've got to have with someone who is over you in the authority structure of the church. Recognize, well, your authority is even higher than his if you are speaking as the voice of God. So Nathan understood that. Secondly, Nathan had some bad news to bring. Nathan wasn't just going to confront David in his sin. Now, David had committed adultery with Bathsheba. He had arranged for the murder of Bathsheba's husband, and then he had taken Bathsheba as his wife. I think it was wife number 6 or 7. So there are multiple things there that Nathan wanted to bring to light, and part of that had to do with a judgment, punishment, that David, because of this, there are going to be negative consequences on your family, your children, and grandchildren. This is going to be awful. And so Nathan had some bad news. There's no way around it. And this was a private conversation that would eventually become public. Obviously, we're reading it today in 2 Samuel 12. And so this is why it was difficult. What Nathan had going for him, I think, was he had a relationship with David. We don't know the details of that relationship. We know, though, that David was at least willing to listen to him. He was willing to listen to Nathan, to invite him into his home. Nathan said, I need to talk to you. And so they had a relationship there. And it reminds us that all of these conversations ideally need to be rooted in a relationship. If you have invested in a person, it's going to make this conversation a lot easier. If you don't know the person very well and you haven't taken the time to get to know them and know who they are inside and out, then this conversation becomes more difficult. But that's why it's important to focus on the relationship first. And then Nathan uses a story to illustrate truth. Now, I don't know how that's going to play out in the specific difficult conversations that you might have with someone, but if you can find some way to illustrate it, that's going to be super important. Our minds can grab onto metaphors and pictures and stories to communicate truth in a way that sometimes the direct word doesn't work as well. And Nathan is just masterful at this. Nathan never has to say a word directly to David about what he's done. He just tells a story. And David is so acutely aware of his sin that he sees himself in the story. He doesn't need Nathan to point the finger. He points the finger essentially at himself. Nathan says, you're the man in the story. And David says, yeah, you're right. You're right. So look for illustrations, look for analogies, look for word pictures to tell your story and have that conversation. Of course, this is going to require some preparation. So I mentioned before, delay does not make it easier. So in fact, it may make it worse. So as soon as possible, as difficult as it might be, schedule that, make that happen. Practice what you're going to say. If you need to do this before you meet with them, do it with another confidential partner if you can, to practice what you're going to say. And third, have a plan of action in mind. Have a solution in mind. Have some steps going forward. Think through, what do you want this person to do as a result of this conversation going forward? And of course, pray over this, because these conversations are usually matters of the heart, of pretty deep issues. And know that God is greater than our hearts, and God can be working in someone's life well before we meet with him. And this is what I found almost always in these conversations that I've dreaded. When I get to the moment and I've prayed about it, God has already gone before me and has softened hearts and is working ahead of us. Some ground rules, some practical issues here. One would be to be in private but not in isolation, meaning a place that you can speak in confidence and yet not just the two of you alone where you might be vulnerable to a false accusation. Second, stay at eye level. Speak as equals. This is not a place for you to sit even behind a desk. I would come around and sit in a chair, just face to face with the person. Something about sitting behind a desk or in an office chair, says I'm more important than you or something. But speak as equals. Speak directly to the person. Make eye contact. If you are nervously looking away, avoiding eye contact, that's going to be distracting and going to make them even more uncomfortable. Speak as calmly as possible. And again, this comes from practice and preparation, knowing what you're going to say, having said it before. Be direct. Use specific examples. If it's a behavior that you're wanting to talk about, be able to document that. Say, well, you're late to practice. 3 out of the 4 of the last rehearsals. You're 15 minutes late here. Just document that stuff so that it's really beyond dispute if that were to come up. So cite specific examples. No interrupting. By this, I just mean let them speak. Let them tell their story, and be a good listener at this moment. Be sure you understand what the other person has said before you respond. And one way to do that is to simply rephrase what they've just said. Say, so what you're saying is, and then you repeat back to them what they've just said, and they can affirm that. Approach the conversation with the desire to solve the problem rather than prove who's right. Approach it with that very solution-oriented outlook and not a I'm right, you're wrong, I win, you lose approach. Focus on the topic at hand. It may be easy. In fact, the person may want to distract and may want to say, well, but what about, and And that's good. That's our natural reaction, is to deflect and defer to someone else or some other situation. But focus on the issue at hand. Bring it back to that always. Take responsibility for your own words and actions. So recognize that in most situations, no one is 100% innocent. There may be things that you've said or things that you've done, maybe even unknowingly, that have contributed to the problem. So own up to that in that moment. And finally, assume the best in others and believe that they can change. That's always my default position, is to optimistically recognize that God is in the business of redeeming and transforming us. And if we'll let him, he can help us change. So I don't know if you are in one of those moments right now where you need to have a difficult conversation with someone, but I pray that you wouldn't delay. It's not going to get any easier, and it may make things worse. So pray about it and follow these steps and have that conversation.